A Donkey Kong game that actually sucks? Consoles dropping like flies? And the missing link between two classic Star Wars movies? Use your toe cable on the subscribe button and find out why we hate 1996. It's about this cat, and it's mostly known for being a complete disaster, but I don't think it gets the credit it deserves for being a pioneer in the 3D gaming space. It pushed the envelope, it tried to do things that hadn't been done before, and it failed spectacularly. But without it, who knows where we'd be.
3D gaming in 1996, we were still kind of in the baby steps phase. You know, we were getting there with the release of stuff like the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation the year prior, and then the release of the N64 in 96. But really, like, 3D gaming hadn't fully taken off yet. You know, we had some examples in the arcade, games like Virtua Fighter. We had some examples on console, games like Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, and Virtua Racing on the Sega Genesis and 32X. Like, there were examples of 3D gaming out there, but we hadn't fully embraced it, not for all genres. And that kind of hurt Bubsy 3D.
It had atrocious level design. You might say that it was very grid-like in its map. You could see every square. You could see it was very geometric. And you could see that as like almost a demo for 3D gaming. You could see how they were parsing it out and how it would make sense. It doesn't really look like it should be an actual game the way that the maps look. But if you can see past the checkered look, the fact that it looks like it's a playtest, like it's just a complete demo, you can see what they were trying to do. And what they were trying to do was also probably not very good.
In the 90s, every company had to have a mascot. You saw mascots everywhere. You saw mascots for things you didn't care about. Raisins? Guess what? There's a mascot for that, you know? Do you remember Jazz the Jackrabbit? Do you remember Awesome Possum? Like, every company felt like they needed some sort of like snazzy mascot, and it was just the boom of that sort of thing at the time. You know, Mario was around, Sonic was around, Crash Bandicoot was also introduced in 96. I think every company just kind of felt like they were obligated to have a mascot of sorts, and a lot of them have died over the years. A lot of them are gone. Some of them still stick around in various forms or are reimagined. But it was a different time in 96.
Bubsy was one of those early mascots that had a bunch of catchphrases. All of his little sayings and quips had to do with cats, a cat catastrophe, if you will, etc. If you can think of it, it was probably in this game. And honestly, I kind of love it. You might get annoyed by it. Some people might think that it's, you know, shrug, it's groan-inducing. I don't think so. I thought it was cool, I thought it was charming, and I liked it.
The death of Bubsy was slow and painful. I think it was clear from the onset with Bubsy's introduction that maybe things weren't going to end well for him. You know, I think his first game was probably his most well-received one, and after that it was just kind of all downhill, kind of culminating with the game Bubsy 3D that we're talking about here, where things just sort of fell apart for the guy. And you know, did he deserve this fate? I don't know. He was kind of created to be this, right? To just be a thing to market. But oddly enough, like we've seen a weird resurgence of Bubsy. There have been a couple modern Bubsy games that have been all right, and then now there's like Bubsy 4D is going to be coming out, and that's like a 3D platformer that actually looks good. So, like, is there a redemption arc for the Bobcat? I guess we'll find out. Sonic Blast on the Sega Game Gear is a weird game. It's a 2D Sonic game, which had been done before on Game Gear and off of Game Gear, of course, on stuff like the Sega Genesis. But also, like, it tried to incorporate pre-rendered graphics, sort of like Donkey Kong Country. And Donkey Kong Country came out 2 years prior. So to try this graphical style on the Game Gear of all places was strange. You know, they were making a 2D game. You played as Sonic or Knuckles. It was a very basic looking Sonic game, but it was trying to be visually appealing on an 8-bit handheld.
During the early console wars, there was the Game Boy, one of the best-selling consoles of all time. This incredible machine that played classics. And then there was the Game Gear. Not so much. I think it's held in high regard by Sega fans. It did play like lesser versions of Sega games, and then I'm sure it had its own classics, quote unquote. But I think it's most notoriously known for having like the worst battery life ever. It ate through batteries like crazy. There was an adapter, I believe, for it, just like there was for the Game Boy, but most users just use batteries, but it would just destroy battery life. So, other than that, though, apparently it was okay.
With it using pre-rendered graphics on something like the Sega Game Gear, you know, this game would probably have been more suited for the Genesis, which at the time of this game, they were doing 3D Blast, which actually like looks impressive for the Genesis. It looks like a 3D game. So I felt like they were trying to mimic some of that, but on the Game Gear as like a companion game. And maybe that was the wrong choice. If this team wanted to make a pre-rendered, you know, 2D platformer, maybe they should have done it on the Genesis. Maybe it would have looked better. It could have, you know, rivaled something like Donkey Kong Country. But doing it on the Game Gear kind of makes it look cheap. It makes it look gross. It looks blown up. And it, you know, with the small screen of the Game Gear, it means if you really want to like focus in on these 3D models you've created for this game, you don't see a lot of the screen, and that's kind of important when you're playing Sonic.
Sonic at the time was going through a rough patch. Was kind of losing his identity. He's supposed to be the Sega mascot, but he hasn't really hit in a while. So they're struggling to find a place for Sonic. And the Game Gear games, I don't believe, were helping him. They weren't the worst offenders, but they just weren't hitting it out of the park.
And really around this time, we enter, you know, what's considered one of the Dark Ages. There's a few different Dark Ages of Sonic the Hedgehog. And, you know, this was around the time of the first Dark Age, between the Genesis trilogy and Sonic Adventure on Dreamcast. Like, around this time, the time of the Saturn and stuff, Sonic was just kind of farting around for a little bit. Kind of, you know, not all of his releases were bad games, but it was definitely like this point where it felt like Sega didn't fully know what to do with the guy. They didn't really know what they should be doing with Sonic at this time. And I think Sonic Blast on Game Gear could be the poster boy of like what the hell are we even doing at this point?
Sonic 3D Blast was on the Saturn. It was also on the Genesis. People actually argue which version is better. I've only played the I played the Genesis version, I think. I played one of the versions and it was fine. It's generally okay. It's not Sonic's best outing. It's awkward, but it is cool to look at Sonic in 3D, whereas before he was just like a 2D platformer. So just for that novelty's sake alone, it's pretty cool. It still retains some of his speed, although I think some of it gets lost in translation. But it was fun. It was fun. It's an early attempt at 3D, which a lot of different games were trying it at the time, and this one has its own isometric, kind of slanted take. It was okay. Not his best.
Virtua Fighter 2 releases for the Sega Genesis, which is a very strange release considering that Virtua Fighter 2 is not only a 3D game, but it's a sequel to an already established 3D fighter, Virtua Fighter 1. So to port Virtua Fighter 2 over to the Sega Genesis was a bad choice by Sega because the game does not work on the Sega Genesis in a 2D state. It is a strange oddity to see. It's kind of fun to mess around with for a minute, but it is not worth playing at all.
Fighting games had become super popular this was the era of arcades, raging, and everyone loving Mortal Kombat, everybody loving Street Fighter. And relative to that concept, they're fairly easy to make. You don't have to come up with worlds and everything. You just put them in a pretty simple environment and let two characters just beat the crap out of each other. There were a ton that got released, and some notable ones from 1996 were Tekken 2, Tobal Number 1, Fighters Mega Mix, Dead or Alive with the ladies, Soul Edge, and Virtua Fighter 3. There's a bunch of others that got released, but this is just a handful of them to name a few of just how many were coming out at the time.
Fighting games really took off in the early 90s, and it's thanks to games like Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat that really pushed this competitive edge in arcade gamers, where, most arcade games before fighting games were just kind of high score based games. There were some competitive games, of course, but most of the games were competitive in the way that you would try to beat the scores, right? But with the introduction of Street Fighter 2 and its combo system and its unique character roster, it allowed people to compete on a level that they hadn't previously been able to. And it kind of had this sense of community where people would be lined up, putting their quarters on the machine, saying, I'm next, I'm playing. And you would have your own character. People got good at certain characters. If you're playing Street Fighter 2 and you're good at Blanca, and somebody else is good at Chun-Li, it made you feel, there was a sense of individuality with choosing your fighter and practicing your fighter. And it made fighting games very popular.
Fighting games were super attractive to make because all you really had to make were the characters themselves. Now, you had to put a lot of work into them because Mortal Kombat set this precedent where they were doing motion capture, they were doing these amazing effects. But all you really have to do is nail that. The environments are basically background noise, unless you're doing a 3D one. But even the 3D ones were really just an arena, and then the backgrounds were flavor. So it's not like a platform where we have to worry about level design. You don't have to worry about bosses. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. You only really have to worry about the fighting game itself, just the interaction between the two characters. And I bet you a lot of this stuff was already a built-in engine, so they didn't even have to do a lot of work there. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm just guessing. And so they were really able to crank out a lot of fighting games, probably for not that much money. And you got to just be creative, so you could just put your own spin on each one, and they would be, fundamentally different than the other just by the style.
The decline of arcades sort of started around this time period. They were still going strong at places like Japan, but arcades seemed less necessary when it came to gaming around this time because you started to see a lot more of the games you could play in the arcade at home. And you've always seen that on the Atari and the NES and stuff, but now you could play a game on the Sega Saturn or on the PlayStation 1, and it's probably going to be pretty comparable to the arcade experience. And not only that, but a lot of video games around this time were shifting away from arcade focus, score focused gaming and that sort of stuff. So, a lot more people were interested in stuff like RPGs or adventure games, platformers. So you had a lot less, audience for the type of games you'd play in the arcade.
There were a lot of ports of arcade fighters, so the arcade was booming, but it was starting to fall, and it would be gone by the next decade. But they were taking all these fighters that were on arcades, which were more powerful machines, and they were porting them to consoles because why not? Which makes you think about if there were people that were playing these games at home, getting really, really good, then going to the arcade to play. And it's almost like cheating. who knows? I'm not a fighting game expert, so I don't want to say that they were. I don't know how people frowned upon them or looked upon them for doing that. But yeah, it was an interesting time because it was like you could actually play arcade games at home now, which was something that really wasn't done at the time.
And the eventual death of the arcade would come a few years later in the 2000s. Like, you know, fighting games really took a crash around that time period. And, you know, we're in 96, we're still pretty okay. Like, there is an oversaturation of fighting games, but they're still decently popular. But they just, you know, the bubble keeps expanding. And the death of arcades came in the early 2000s. A lot of them in America have just shut down. Still popular in Japan, but Japan's a way different place. You know, but I think most countries' arcades became less popular. Also, the advent of online gaming became a thing. So even if you want a more social experience, you didn't really need to go to an arcade anymore. And you know, with the death of arcades came the death of fighting games for a while. Yeah, and it was, you know, it would eventually be brought back, but there for a little bit, it was dead.
Shadows of the Empire is bigger than video games. Remember Empire Strikes Back? And do you remember Return of the Jedi? Well, this is right in the middle of those two stories. This is Star Wars, almost canon. Probably not at this point, but it still seemed like it was. And they even made toys of Shadows of the Empire. It starred Dash Rendar, who helped in the Battle of Hoth. Actually, early on in the game, you are in the Battle of Hoth, so it's almost like parallel with Empire, but it goes a little bit further than Empire does, and it's a whole lot of fun.
The early N64 felt like Nintendo had a lot to prove with their little machine. You know, they were still sticking to cartridges because they're stubborn, and they were, you know, full 3D gaming for the first time in the company's history. And it felt like they had a lot to prove on the early N64, and they came out swinging. You know, we talked about Mario 64 in the other episode. Great game, and it honestly, like, from there, it felt like Nintendo was just trying to prove that, like, 3D gaming was necessary for a lot of their games. And, you know, they didn't have the biggest library of games on the console, but they tried to incorporate other companies when they could. And you could tell with Star Wars that they were a big focus. I mean, there was a Stormtrooper on the back of the N64 box, like next to Mario.
You know, I don't know where if this is still considered canon because now that Disney owns it, I don't actually know that Shadows of the Empire is considered canon, but I'm guessing no. But it would be really cool if they brought it back, because I think everybody actually kind of likes its edition. It gets more into the swoop gang, like the underground culture from Star Wars, as opposed to like the main stuff you see. Like it would be the Jabba the Hutt side of Star Wars instead of the Empire side. Although the Empire is in it. I don't want to say it's not in it, but you just get a window into like the seedy underbelly and see some new villains. So really cool. I don't know if it's officially canon, but Disney, the ball's in your court.
Dash Rendar. Man, I love Dash Rendar. He's a character that is not used anymore. I forget what they call all the pre-Disney buyout stuff now. It's like the legacy timeline or some shit. But Dash Rendar, you know, was just another one of those space smuggler type characters. And he's not really that notable. You can read a few of the books, and they talk about Dash Rendar and his character. But, you know, he's just kind of a suave dude. He's a cool dude. And you want to play as him in Shadows of the Empire. And he's the sort of character that we don't really see a lot of anymore. Disney Plus, please give us the Dash Rendar series, please.
This game is janky. So on the N64, The controller is just weird. It's good for certain 3D games, but it's not really good for first-person shooters. I say that knowing full well that GoldenEye and Perfect Dark are on there. I don't think they're very playable now unless you change the control schemes. Come fight me. This game has elements of first-person. It has elements of third-person. It has spaceship shooter segments. Those play pretty well. The non-spaceship shooter segments are odd. They do a lot of weird things in them. They don't really feel like they don't. Clearly, first-person shooters and shooters in general went a certain direction. This did not go in that direction. So when you play it, you have to relearn. You have to try to put yourself in the shoes of what gaming was like before 3D gaming was legit and real. And much like Bubsy, it was trying to do something that hadn't been done a whole lot. So you have to forgive it for some things.
Looking back on it, Shadows of the Empire is an ambitious game. It's an ambitious game for Star Wars, especially. A universe that was so beloved at this time. You know, we weren't yet in the prequel era yet. That's a few years off. So, yeah, we're still selling okay. You know, we're still living it up with the original trilogy. And to try a full 3D adventure game on the level of something like Tomb Raider is ambitious. And I like a lot of what Shadows of the Empire does, but it's undeniable that, like, it has some pretty early 3D things in it that are janky. The controls, the camera, just some of the vehicle gameplay, like, some of it is a little suspect now, going back to it. But, you know, at the time, it definitely was an ambitious game, and I don't want to take that away from Shadows of the Empire.
The 3DO was discontinued in 1996. It was a competitor to Sony's PlayStation and Sega's Saturn, with being a 32-bit console. Unfortunately, it released for an eye-watering $700. So it was unable to compete with the much, much cheaper alternatives. And it also didn't have as many great games. The 3DO will not be missed.
Come on, let's go fight Ganon's evil legions. I'll show you how.
The Philips CDI, the Compact Disc Interactive, is this digital optical disc data storage format, and it was it was supposed to be like an educational tool and something you could watch movies on, or movies, quote unquote, like very small, but just like a media player. But it mostly became known for its video games, and not in a good way. It was generally a disaster in what it attempted to do, but its history is filled with little Easter eggs for what was to come in the world of video games.
CDI, the Philips CDI, didn't really have a lot of games to really mention here. But the ones you know, the ones that we all know, are the Nintendo ones. Games like Hotel Mario and Zelda, the Wand of Gamelon, and The Faces of Evil, and whatever the other one was called, The Adventures of Zelda, I think it was called. I don't remember. Those 4 games are probably the reason why people want a CDI in the first place now, is to kind of just play those and experience those. Because it was strange having Nintendo stuff. And, you know, Nintendo, they never reference those games now, because they know that they got a shit deal with Philips on that. But yeah, it's weird. And other than that, you know, I think most of the CDI games were all like FMV stuff. I don't remember. I don't remember if Plumbers Don't Wear Ties is on CDI or if that's 3DO. There's all those mid-90s CD-based consoles blend together in my head.
One of the biggest things that came from it was, the Philips CDI was worked on originally by Sony and Philips. And then Sony went on to help Nintendo try to make a Super Nintendo with a CD disc drive. And they actually did it. And they called it the PlayStation. It's weird. I feel like I've heard that before. But Nintendo went behind their back and switched over to Philips like a day after it was shown or something like that. And that Philips relationship fizzled. But PlayStation was completely embarrassed by that, as they should be. And they decided that they would step into the video game wars. They knew how video games worked at that point, and they went their own direction. I don't know whatever happened to those guys. So maybe Sony did something. I don't. Did they do video games? Did they do a game?
And CD gaming was the big deal around this time. I mean, PlayStation just came out. Sega Saturn's out. You know, we had the Sega CD previously. We have stuff like the 3DO. Like, CD gaming was clearly the way of the future. I mean, you could put so much more on a compact disc, and they were cheaper to produce. You know, and you had great like sound quality. You could put FMV movies and stuff on them. It was clearly the way to go. I felt like CD gaming kind of fumbled for a little bit though, and I think the CDI is some leftover remnants of that. You know, where the technology for CDI when it was being developed probably wasn't there yet, as it, you know, because having the CDI out the same year as the PlayStation is a little embarrassing if you put them side by side. But yes, I mean, CD gaming was huge, and it was clear that like we were going there and we were never coming back.
The CDI did not do particularly well. They claimed an installed base of 1 million units in 1994. So that's like a while after it released. In 1996, the US sales totaled to 400,000 units. It was generally a complete failure. Most people played very, very few games from it. It's only infamously known for its games, as somebody else will probably cover. In 1996, it would be completely done. You could still like license games for it after that point, but like Philips had completely abandoned it.
And there was just an overabundance of tech companies around this time trying to get into this market. Some of them did. Most of them didn't. You know, I mean, Philips tried. They didn't do it. Panasonic tried. They didn't do it. Apple even tried. They didn't do it. Remember the Apple Pippin? The only company around this time, a few years later, that actually got in was Microsoft with the Xbox. And that almost felt like a happy accident, like, you know, because Sega fell out of the market, that they were able to kind of fill a slot. But yeah, I mean, there were so many tech companies around this time that were just trying their hand to get a piece of this pie, get a piece of the gaming pie. And it made some of the consoles feel cheap and unnecessary. Not cheap price-wise, because they were expensive, but cheap in terms of like what they were actually delivering, you know? If you look at the quality of content on the Philips CDI, and then you look at the quality content that you could get from going and buying a used Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis at this time, it's crazy how much more you would get out of playing those older devices. And you would think it would be the opposite, but it wasn't.
The Virtual Boy was Nintendo's virtual reality console. Can you believe it? Nintendo's doing virtual reality in 1990s. And it sucked! It was a complete disaster, and it died in 1996. It was known for strapping something onto your head. You'd see it. You could barely play any games on it. And it would probably give you a headache.
I'm not going to list every single game for the Virtual Boy, even though I could. There's only like 12. But some notable games is Mario Clash, which is like a 3D perspective take on Mario Brothers, like the arcade Mario Brothers, which is pretty, you know, interesting. Wario Land, my boy Wario is here on the Virtual Boy. And he had a Wario Land game on the Virtual Boy, and Nintendo never re-released this until now. It's finally on the Switch too. But even then, you need a stupid headset to play it. There were the Teleboxer, whatever that game, Robo Teleboxer, whatever the hell that game's called. That's a game. You know, there was a game based on their Nintendo Power character that he was bowling or something. Nestor, I think it was Nestor's Funky Bowling. And what's the library on the Virtual Boy is weird because other than the Mario one, oh yeah, Mario Tennis. Other than Mario Tennis, Mario Clash, and Wario Land, it felt like Nintendo didn't trust the console with their characters. Like, you know, there's no reason why there shouldn't have been a Kirby game on here or a Zelda game or something, you know. And maybe those things would have come along if the console had more than a year, you know, to live, you know, before they shot it out back. But I see some of the games like the 3D flight game and the boxing game and the bowling game, and I'm like, yeah, these aren't even like C-listers. These are D-listers, you know.
Do you like the color red? If you were trying to play a Virtual Boy game, I sure hope you did, because that's the color that you were getting. Every game was a disgusting red, bright color that just pounded into your face. It didn't matter which game you were playing, that's the experience. It really was. It's almost like they didn't play test this at all. They just wanted to build it on hype alone. And you see that a lot now, and it's a disaster now, and it's a disaster then. It's just like, forget about if there's any quality, just what if the idea that there's a virtual reality console in the 90s is enough? Spoiler alert, it wasn't.
And Nintendo, being Nintendo, made some of the smartest choices of all time. One of which being the console's vision is all red. Now, I understand it's complicated to make a virtual device in the year 1996, but to have the screen be all red and you stick your eyes up to it, how did nobody catch that at Nintendo? How did nobody think, you know what, maybe this isn't a good idea? And people complained about headaches, about blurry vision. I mean, I've seen stuff from press releases before the thing came out, and people were, journalists were complaining about it. I don't know how Nintendo didn't see that and say, like, maybe we need to stop and think about this for a second. But then again, it's the Virtual Boy. I don't know if any good choices were really made in that entire, decision-making process.
People didn't really try with Virtual Boy games, nor could they. I'm sure it was like a absolute disaster to try to code anything on it. But there was games like Virtual Lab that's famously, it seems like unsolvable, and then Waterworld, which is considered like unfinished. You never want your game to be described as unfinished. But all these games, I mean, even just any of the games, they just kill you when you try to play them for extended periods of time. They will destroy your brain. So even if you're a historian, just skip the Virtual Boy and accept that it was trash. Don't bother playing it if you can even find a way to do it. It's a disaster.
Contra Legacy of War releases on PlayStation, and man, what a ugly game. It is a third-person 3D Contra game, which, is a valiant effort by Konami. But they traded out the beautiful pixel art of the original Contra games on the 16-bit and 8-bit consoles for something so drab and clunky to play. It is not as precise as you would like for a run-and-gun game. Notable effort from Konami, failed game. The Sega CD is Sega's add-on for the Sega Genesis. One of two add-ons that they made, the other one being the 32X, of course. And the Sega CD kind of slid onto the console. If you had the Model 2, if you had the Model 1, there was a bottom piece that you put on, and the tray came out. So there are two different models of the CD. And the CD, definitely of the two add-ons, it definitely was the more successful one. But I say successful with quotes, successful, because while it had a decent library and it was capable of outputting some cool audio and stuff, it wasn't enough to really save the Genesis, like I think like Sega wanted it to like extend the life of the console. And that's really what these add-ons were meant to do. They were meant to extend the life of the console because Sega saw that the Genesis was going to die.
FMV stands for full motion video. And it's like an alternative to what we would call in-game cutscenes. It was the attempt to use real life, like filmed on film footage of things in video games. And before the PlayStation, before CD drives, this was very hard to put onto a cartridge. There's just not enough memory. But CDs had a lot of memory. So you started to see full motion video on CD-based consoles. So it would be like real footage. You'd see it in football games. I remember that being a thing where you'd actually see like scenes from ESPN or wherever football stuff happens. But it was a much more immersive visual experience. But I wouldn't say it was something that transformed gaming because it wasn't. It was almost like games and the video were separate. And it felt that way because graphically, of course, they were nowhere near each other.
And extending the Genesis life is an interesting idea because, you know, we sort of think of things now in like console cycles. Like clearly the PlayStation 4 died and then the 5 and then, you know, 5's going to go away, then the 6, you know, and that's just kind of how things work, right? That's kind of how gaming works for us now. But back then, like the idea that you could buy a console and then it could go like out of fashion was not something we were used to yet. Like there are people that got the Nintendo and then were like, why do I need to buy a Super Nintendo? I already have a Nintendo. And I think that's where Sega was with their add-ons. I think they were trying to appease that market of people saying like, well, I already have a Sega Genesis and all of these games, and I've already put so much money into your ecosystem with this stuff and bought these toys and whatever else you need with it. Why do I need to buy a Saturn? You know, and I feel like that's sort of where Sega was. They were trying to put the Genesis on life support and kind of prolong the inevitable. And it probably hurt them in the long run because yeah, like maybe a few people that had the Genesis, you know, still around this time period were happy to buy the add-ons and kind of have a little bit of an extended life, but it caused people not to trust Sega because they constantly released hardware. They released a CD add-on and then 32X add-on, and then they released a Saturn, and then, you know, and by the time the Saturn came out, people didn't trust the company anymore. So really, I think all the Genesis add-ons kind of hurt.
Some notable games for the Sega CD were obviously Sonic CD. It's considered one of the better Sonic games of its time. This era obviously is rough for Sonic, but it's up there. Lunar, the Silver Star, and Lunar Eternal Blue. Snatcher. There's a guy that made that game that's, I don't know, he's kind of popular now. Earthworm Jim Special Edition, Final Fight CD, and the infamous Night Trap, which uses FMV to its fullest potential. That might be an infamous Sega CD game, but there are some to check out. So there you go.
So you had the Sega CD, right? And then you had the 32X, and the 32X plopped on top of the Genesis and had a 32-bit processor, which means you could play some more complicated games. Most of the games were either early 3D stuff like Virtual Racing, Virtual Fighter, Doom, or, you know, some pretty looking 2D games. And the 32X was a failure for sure, but it's at least kind of interesting in what it was trying to do. But then Sega had an idea. They had a crazy idea. They said, "Hey guys, what if not only do we have games for the Sega CD and then games for the 32X? What if we have games that require you to have both a Sega CD and a 32X?" Genius, right? I don't know anybody that had both of those add-ons, you know, and unless you're like a collector or something. I don't know anybody that owned both add-ons and said, "Wow, I can play Sega CD 32X games now." Terrible idea. That's just a bad choice.
Sega was really struggling at this time. You could tell that they'd staggered a lot of major releases like very closely together. They were trying to look for a hit, and the hits just were not coming. It's kind of frustrating to look back at this era because they had built a lot of trust with the Genesis, and they were at this point completely squandering it. Like, they would start something, abandon it when, you know, everybody would buy into it because it was Sega. They're like, well, it's Sega's next big thing. Abandon it and try something else. And it's really bad business practice. This should be one of the biggest lessons people take from Sega, is if you're going to start something, even if it doesn't work out immediately, really just try to get it to work. Try to focus on it and try to build it, because you do not want to lose brand loyalty. If you lose that, it's game over. It was like a video game thing.
Donkey Kong Country 3 is the third game in the Donkey Kong Country series, starting in 94, and then the second game was in 95, and then now we're at 3 in 96. It was kind of a yearly thing at this point on the Super Nintendo. A late release, you know, the N64 is out now, but Country 3 came out, and you know, they started to stray farther away from Donkey Kong since the first game. It was like the first game was DK and Diddy, and then the second one was Diddy and Dixie, and then now it's Dixie and Kitty. You know, it kind of felt like they were just, Donkey Kong was barely a part of the equation anymore with the third game, and I like Country 3, but it's definitely the black sheep of the original trilogy.
Donkey Kong Country has this amazing legacy on the Super Nintendo of like one of the few, it's in series, you could say games, but series that people associate with the Super Nintendo that's not Nintendo. Like, everyone just assumes, well, it's Donkey Kong. That's his iconic look. Like, that's what Donkey Kong looks like now, not created by Nintendo. And that's bizarre to think about, especially for this era. But it's true. Like, it's a great series that Nintendo didn't work on, but they gave them the license to do it, and Rare completely knocked it out of the park. And people just say Donkey Kong, they're talking about this Donkey Kong, the one that Rare made.
Rare was on top of their game at this point, though. I mean, not only did they have the 3 Donkey Kong Country games, they also had Killer Instinct, and they were about to enter their best era with the N64 on market. You know, I mean, it's needless to say, the part of the reason to own an N64 was for the Rare library. I mean, they were killing it with their game development, and there is a reason why they're such a legendary studio, even though, honestly, I mean, they made a few decent things on Xbox, but honestly, their legacy kind of ends with the N64. But they're still talked about today because they made great games.
3 took some interesting strides. So in like all the Donkey Kong countries, they move, one of the characters gets swapped out. So in the original Donkey Kong Country, it was Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong. Then Donkey Kong for the second one, Donkey Kong got abducted, and it was Diddy Kong, Dixie Kong. Well, in this one, it's Dixie Kong, Baby Kong. And Baby Kong is almost like going back to Donkey Kong, but he's bigger than him. He's just this big, clumsy guy. So that was initially a difference that people didn't really like, which is kind of weird because Donkey Kong wasn't in the second one. So like, why do they complain now? But also the map was different. Instead of you clicking on where to go next, you got to freely explore, which I thought was actually kind of cool. Those are the 2 main differences. I think the biggest one that people had an issue with, though, was Baby Kong.
I kind of touched on it earlier, but does Donkey Kong Country 3 have bad characters? I mean, I like Dixie, you know, but she definitely felt more like a sidekick character, even more than Diddy Kong did. So to give her a game felt kind of weird to do. And then you have Kitty Kong. Who the fuck is Kitty Kong? I mean, you know, I understand wanting to give Dixie a spotlight, for sure, but you want to give her like a strong character to run alongside her, and you have to make up like a new baby character to do it, and you realize you had a strong character. His name's Donkey Kong. Why didn't you just make Donkey Kong the sidekick or something? Or maybe they didn't want to do that. But the game, he's not in the game anyway. He could have at least been in the game. And that felt like a weird choice that kind of disconnected people from the game. Also, the world itself is a weird character, I think, because the first two games still kind of felt like jungle-y. Even though the second game goes all over the place, but still felt sort of in that realm. And then we're in like a northern, like Canada type place for the third game, and there's bears and stuff. So I feel like a lot of those elements too kind of, you know, held the game back from being as legendary as the first two games. I definitely like Country 3, but it's like my least favorite.
One thing that may have hurt this game was that it was a big release, but it was after the Nintendo 64 was released, so maybe a lot of people just didn't care, which is a shame because this is not a terrible game. It's not their best, but it's not a terrible game. But I think everyone was probably just really excited about the N64, and they were excited about what Donkey Kong could do on this new console that did 3D gaming, whereas they released one on the Super Nintendo that had like the visuals almost of a 3D game, but it was not a 3D game, and everyone kind of knew it. And they were, maybe at this point people were just like, I'm done with 3D or 2D platformers. Like, we've had that for so long. Give me something else, because the newer consoles can do new things. Let's do that. And I guess this one just got pushed by the wayside. Boy, 1996 sure had some stinkers, didn't it? But if you love 1996 and want to see some of the great games that came out of it, make sure you check out our Why We're Obsessed with 1996 video. It's definitely around. It's probably somewhere on the side or underneath what you're watching right now. And by the way, I actually like Shadows of the Empire. So even though we put it in here, we just wanted an excuse to talk about it, and it didn't really fit with the other one. So there you go. No hate, please.